Hello everyone, welcome to Dell EMC Networking OMNM Tech Talk. This is Bill Acevedo, and today we're going to talk about application architecture, and this is going to be a two-part tech talk. This will be followed up with a discussion about application logs and some troubleshooting. Today we're going to cover primarily the main elements of the software. We are going to record this session, and so it will be available for review later. Okay, let's get started. So for today's Tech Talk, this is going to be the graphic we're going to refer to in terms of talking about the architecture. And so you see here at a high level, what we have is the OMNM server in the square box. Within that box, we have the major elements of OMNM, which include a web server, an application server, and a med server. We'll talk about that. And then we also have the database component. And on the outside of that, we have the web browser as well as a managed network, and their relative parts in the architecture. So let's go ahead and get started talking about the web server. As you all probably already know, the web server allows us to have a browser-based client. The OMNM Web GUI is built on a customized portal framework that's called Liferay. So you'll hear the term Liferay in some cases, and when we start looking at logs, you may see exceptions related to Liferay, and that's where that reference comes from. You'll see here some arrows that the web server talks to a database, a couple of database instances actually, and so these databases are called L-Portal and Synergy. The L-Portal is Liferay's database, and it is intended to manage Liferay artifacts, things such as users, roles, organizations, and some portlet type configuration, layouts, that kind of thing. There's a second database that we've created for OMNM, we've customized, and that's called Synergy. And so the Synergy database instance is the OMNM database that contains items like portlets, preferences, and filters, and things more related to the OMNM NMS. And as you also probably already know, the web server is auto-installed to start up automatically. So as soon as you reboot the server or reboot the box, the web server will automatically come up. Okay, next we have the application server. And so in the graphic here you see there's three heavy arrows here pointing to between the web server and the application server. So as requests come in from a user related to NMS features, that filters directly into the application server. And so the application server does all of the NMS related work. And when you install the application initially, this is the server that you are binding to that IP address. When you set that IP address in the installation, this is what we're binding. And there's this concept of a mediation server, and this is what basically talks to managed elements. The app server and mediation server can be distributed, but this option is not available in a single server SKU. On single server deployments, the mediation server functionality is performed by the application server, so you're only going to hear the reference of application server when we talk about single server. I'm just noting here that if we do have a distributed deployment, you will hear this. You will hear mention of the mediation server, and it's going to be that mediation server that's going to be between the application server and the network managed network, communicating with the devices. And I'll mention here also that on distributed deployments, you may have n number of application servers or mediation servers in a cluster configuration. These are for high availability, high performance systems where you need to distribute these across either multiple subnets. You cluster the application server for redundancy and for performance, and that is a separate SKU that you can purchase, but is you're not going to see that on standalone deployments. Then one last thing here, just a note here, that when the license expires, the subscription, when it expires, what it does is it stops this application server from starting up. So on that date, that application server will not start up, and you'll see an error in the log. We'll talk about that in the second session, which you would see in that case. Okay. And then at the bottom here we have the database server. And as you already know, the MySQL database is installed by default. You can install an Oracle, but that is also part of the high availability SKU. The databases are the same names, they're just on an Oracle database. And again, the database can also be, as I mentioned, can be distributed. It's not going to be on the same server in most cases when it's HA. It'll be on some separate dedicated database server. Now on a standalone installation though, part of the installer will allow you to basically specify a different path. So if you wanted to install OMNM on one path and then specify some other area where the database should reside, then you can do that as long as it's on the same server. Once you install the application, the connection info, the IP address, and where that database is will be installed, updated in the install.properties file. That will be a file you'll want to look at if you're having database connection problems. Make sure you have the right IP address. And you also see here in the graphic that the web server does write to the database here. It does do a read-write as well. And again, that's to update items that we mentioned before, the roles and permissions and some portal type information. But generally, all of the NMS related work is going to go through the application server first and then written to the database. If you do need to connect to the database, there are third-party applications that you can use. Anything that supports the database connection, like Navicat is another example of a tool that you can use. You just simply need to log in and credentials, and you can see all the table structures and that sort of thing. Oracle has their own set of tools as well. I would caution you, do not attempt to modify anything in the database directly. And this is because there are some complex associations created between various objects, and so while you might see an object, it may have some association to something else, and by modifying that, you will potentially corrupt that association. And so do not do that unless you really, really know the application and what you're doing, and that typically requires you to come to our support group in order to understand that type of behavior. Okay. Kind of the last thing here on the architecture, I want to lay out some of the software and how software names you might see in this architecture to maybe help you kind of put it in perspective on where things are at. And so at the top here, what I'm showing is the web browser. And of course, you know, that can be IE Chrome or Firefox. And some of the common software that's needed at that level are Flash. You need a Flash plugin. That's typically for topology. Now, hopefully by the middle of this year, we're going to be getting off the Flash and using a different technology for our topology views. And so there's some security issues around Flash, and that's why some browsers are struggling to support that. And so it causes a little bit of a user problem. But hopefully we'll get off of that. The Java plugin is also required for command line access. This is also another area that causes some troubles with installing that plugin, configuring it correctly, and then it's another security thing. A lot of browsers are removing that support, and so actually in our next major release around Q2 of this year, we are eliminating that requirement for the Java plugin. Now it's required at that level. And then Adobe is another one. If you want to review reports in the browser, you need to have the Adobe plugin, and so that would need to be installed as well. At the web server level, some names you might hear, as I mentioned already, you're going to hear Synergy is a common name that we use as our internal name for that web server. LifeReg is that portal framework, and the underlying software that supports the web server is basically as Apache Tomcat. At the application server level, might be worth noting that the application is written in Java. That might be important because when we go to look at log files, you're going to see Java type exceptions, and knowing that might help you understand those exceptions a little better. The application server software is supported basically by this application called Jboss. You might hear that term as well. This level is also sometimes referred to as OWare. That's also another internal name that was developed. You may see exceptions with the word OWare in it, and that's why I mention it here. This is the layer where we get, of course, all the NMS functionality, but again, protocol, for example, SNMP, SSH, Telnet, and some other communication protocols are all at that level. And as I mentioned before, at the database, you can use basic SQL communication to go and query tables. We use JDBC to connect to the database. And worth noting here at the bottom, there is some software that is not part of our architecture, but will be required by the software. And I want to note some of those here. Perl. Sometimes people get confused on where Perl resides in this architecture. And so Perl resides on the OMNM server. It's part of the native operating system, whether it's Linux or whether it's Windows. It needs to be installed and needs to be reachable so that when we invoke a Perl script, it can find those libraries. And so where we use that is in actions. And we precede some actions, especially for Dell devices that require Perl. And so when you try to execute one of those, it will fail if this Perl is not installed on the operating system. Another example is Microsoft.NET. If you're doing server-level discovery, we use WMI to discover servers. And so on a Windows box, you would need to install .NET. It's .NET 3 or higher, and that needs to be there. It's typically there, but just worth noting that that resides on the system as well and needs to be available. And then again, if you want to review reports outside of your browser, and you need to have Adobe installed on the operating system. And so this kind of distinguishes how you're some issues you might have trying to see a report, for example. You try to bring it up on a system that doesn't have Adobe outside of a browser, well, it would fail for this reason here. It's not installed, or versus the browser not having it. Okay, this was a very high-level pass on the architecture, and again, what we'd spend in 10 or 15 minutes. Some of that will be referenced in the next section, which will talk about some specific logs in those areas and between those different connectivities, some of the major logs and some recommendations on how to use those logs. I want to thank you for joining. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, and I'm going to open it up for questions.